Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Dr. Liz Harmon. Dr. Harmon, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited for this conversation. It comes in perfect time in March, Women's Month, and you are the digital curator at the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. Long title, impressive title. First, before we dive in, tell us exactly what you do.
So I am part of a small but mighty team at the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum that is bringing the museum to life right now. We're starting from the ground up, and we are creating a digital presence for our museum before we open our doors in about a decade, most likely. Once we have a site on the National Mall and we can build our museum, we will have that physical presence. But until then, we get to be really innovative in our digital strategy and digital approach online as we try to share more women's history with more people than ever before.
You're sharing women's history, but something even more exciting is that you're uncovering women's history. And the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum has found stories that have been previously lost to history. These women are entrepreneurs, inventors, business leaders, and everything in between. So how do these stories get lost in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I always have in the back of my mind as a women's historian is that, as scholars have said for a long time now, it's not enough to prove that women have a history. If that was enough, we'd be done. We know women have been making history for centuries, but that's not enough. We need to show how women's stories are missing. And that's the work that I'm really impassioned to do at the museum. We want to show how women's history is missing. How has it been excluded? How has it been forgotten? How does this actually happen in practice so we can increase the visibility of women's history today? And we do that sometimes through old-fashioned research in the archives. We do that by talking to other curators around the many Smithsonian museums and archives that exist. And then we can share those stories.
Why has it been forgotten? I mean, that's the biggest thing for me. Does it just slip through the cracks? Is there something more nefarious, just an oversight? What have you found?
So one of the things, our first digital exhibition that is launching during Women's History Month on March 8th, we wanted to shed light on this kind of paradox that shapes women's history that comes up over and over again, which is we know that women have been making history for centuries, but their stories are missing from popular narratives. So there's this significance and absence, this paradox in women's history. And our first exhibition tries to tackle that. And we curated 5 different stories from around the Smithsonian to show how each individual's woman's story is kind of gets obscured or lost or forgotten in American history. So we really wanted to take a deep dive. Now, during this kind of 10-minute digital exhibition, we feature 5 different stories. And maybe I'll start by telling you a little bit about each of those 5 people and kind of how their story has been erased. So first person that we feature is Elizabeth Keckley. And she was an entrepreneur and a writer. She was actually born into slavery and then worked as Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker in the White House for 4 years. Now, throughout, Elizabeth Keckley's story is really excluded in many ways, in 2 kind of significant ways. One way is that she's a dressmaker. So when you see photos of women historically in fancy clothes, you think of the person wearing them and you don't think of the person that made them. So there's this rich history of women in fashion and women seamstresses that we often don't acknowledge. The second aspect of Keckley's story, though, has to do with an autobiography that she wrote. And it became a kind of scandal of the era because in the autobiography, she actually tried to defend Mary Todd Lincoln and kind of reversed the kind of racial expectations that people had of a Black woman in that period. Keckley had the kind of agency and will to defend her former employer, and that was looked at as a kind of audacious kind of move and something that was a violation of kind of sharing stories about the private lives of white elite people in the period. But it was really Keckley's own story. And as a result of that, the book didn't sell as much as it could have. And it was really, it changed the course of her life and career subsequently. So that's just one way.
So I know that you have essentially a magnifying glass. You know, hey, I know these stories are out there, but what are you looking for specifically? Dive a little deeper in that process. How do curators know exactly what to look for?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's funny. I think if you are an expert in women's history, we call it, you can almost call it the disappearing ink problem. So, that there are records, there are books, there are archival collections, there's museum collections about women's history because people have been collecting and recording this for centuries. But somehow these stories are missing from popular narratives. So, if you're an expert in women's history, you know those stories. You see them on a daily basis when you're looking at historical newspapers, when you're looking at museum collections. And so, when we were curating this exhibition, what I wanted to do is feature how other experts encounter this problem across disciplines. So in natural history museums, in the Air and Space Museum, and art museums, there's different ways that women stories are eclipsed or forgotten or erased. And so by featuring the voices of other curators, we really get a firsthand account of how different people experience this problem. And it's systemic, so people experience it over and over again. So Keckley's story is just one instance of this, and there's more that we feature in the exhibition.
Talk a little bit about the trends that you've found in these 5 stories, particularly when it comes to business.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think in the first instance, we feature the story of Margaret Knight, who was mechanized the creation of flat bottom paper bags in the 19th century. And over the course of her life, she had, I believe, 27 patents and over 80 inventions. So she really, throughout the course of her lifetime, she was working on engines, she was working on different machines. She was known as really the biggest woman inventor of the 19th century, and newspapers covered her that way. And I think, Margaret's story, we know it in part because a man tried to steal her patent. So when she was creating the flat bottom paper bag, and she was developing the machine, she sent it to a machinist to develop the prototype into a workable machine. And one of the machinists, who was not working on it, but he stole he stole it, and he filed for a patent himself. His name was Charles Annan. Now, Knight fought him, and she filed a patent suit, and she won. And she, in court, Annan tried to make arguments like a woman could never invent this. This wasn't possible. And in the 19th century, you can imagine rhetoric like that standing in a way it wouldn't today, right? But Margaret fought it. She had the kind of documentation of her work for years on the machine to fight this and win this suit. And I think, I think this is really important because document what you do, but also don't be afraid to fight. There are instances, I think, even today, right, where you need to fight for the credit or the kind of violations sometimes that you face.
I'm smiling because I packed my lunch today in a flat bottom paper bag. So her invention still, years and years later, lives on. And I know that the Smithsonian is trying to incorporate AI into this story finding process, but it might be a hindrance to the initial stages of researching and uncovering. Can you talk about that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think working at a cultural heritage institution, some of the things I see right off are the limitations to how we can apply AI right now to do really amazing research. And by that I mean, when you're dealing with women's history, we need to first and foremost improve the representation of women in our historical databases and collections. So right now, the Smithsonian will say we have over 157 million kind of specimens and collections. You can't, so there's tremendous opportunity there, right? To imagine how you could apply AI. You can't manually go through all of that data and all of those objects. So there is real promise and excitement here, but that limitation, first we need to improve the representation of women and women's history in our collections data that's machine readable so that we actually get meaningful stories and meaningful, outputs from the research questions that we're asking with AI. And so, you won't see a kind of full representation of women's history online. And that's what we're working on right now. We want to, ask really powerful research questions and partner with data scientists as as historians, as collections experts, and then create more linked data about women's history at the Smithsonian and beyond. And that promise exists, and I'm really excited about it. But right now, what we're kind of doing first is just trying to, we're trying to improve that representation. But that doesn't mean we can't perform experiments and work collaboratively. So one of the really exciting things that I've had a chance to do is work with data scientists at the Smithsonian and other collections experts to run experiments and say, what could we find if we use different types of custom machine learning tools? So a couple different tools that our team has developed. One is a kind of custom machine learning model to extract women's names that are in spousal pairs. Now maybe this sounds really niche and really small, like Mrs. and Mr. Smith in collections data. But if you go back to the 19th century, and even today sometimes, you'll see these instances where you have Mr. and Mrs. And often in those instances, those Mr. and Mrs. are extracted, and all you're left with is Smith, and there's an assumption usually that it is a man who that name would apply to then. And we have seen this in practice, and we're partly inspired in practice by, I worked with a team to put together a data set about the history of women in science at the Smithsonian, the hundreds of women who over centuries have worked at the Smithsonian. And then data scientists use that data set to compute against our collections data and find more information about these people. Now, what they realized in doing that was that there were instances where one of our kind of beloved historical figures, Mary Vaux Walcott, she was an artist and a botanist. Her story was actually attributed to her husband through her specimen records. They were all, during the digitization and transcription process, her name, Mrs., came out, and it all was attributed to her husband. And data scientists found this because they realized that Charles Walcott, her husband, was dead when a lot of these specimens were collected. So it was obviously Mary Vaux Walcott who had collected them, and we've been able to update our collections records and show that. So it sounds small, but it actually has a really big impact, and that's not a unique story. I know that there's other spousal pairs where the women have not been credited properly for their work.
And that sounds like something that you really would need a human eye, a historian's touch to figure out instead of AI. But I am curious because when you think of a museum, you think of going, seeing it visually, but this one is digitized, this specific exhibit, the digital exhibit Becoming Visible. It launched on International Women's Day. And I am curious if part of the reason your team decided to digitize it is to help the representation of women's history online, make that more visible online.
Yeah, absolutely. Personally, I've been really inspired, right? Like, my research has been all about making women's history discoverable online and working with other collections experts and data scientists to do that. And so when I was thinking about creating and curating this first digital exhibition, that was the exciting opportunity, is to tell stories about women's history where we can actually then improve access to those stories online. But I think, just like we were talking about a minute ago, in order to do that, we have to understand why those stories are missing in the first place. So this digital exhibition really gets to that next layer of asking, why are these stories missing?
Forbes, as I mentioned earlier, covers entrepreneurs, movers and shakers, people in the business world. What do you think our audience needs to know about your research into women's history here?
Yeah, I think one of the most foundational and simple things is that it exists. And I know that sounds silly. We all know women's history exists, right? But I think if you're not a historian, one of the things you might not see on a daily basis is the kind of hundreds of years of scholarship and record collection that folks have done about women's history. And so if you're looking at historical newspapers or you're in a collections database, you really see the richness and the nuance when we're talking about women's history. And one of the really powerful things there is you see the contestation. You see the contestation of the categories of what it means to be a woman, who gets to decide, what does womanhood exactly mean culturally and socially? What are the boundaries on that? How does that intersect with race, class, gender, ethnicity? All of these things come to life with these historical collections. And so I think, knowing that these hundreds of years of stories exist, it's really hopeful, actually, because we have those records to draw from as we tell more stories about women's history and inspire the next generation. So we really do have the capacity to change how we think about women's history and see them in our everyday lives.
Dr. Liz Harmon, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for sharing some of your insights into your research. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you.